Hello everybody and welcome to my Brothers War Draft Guide. In this video, I'm going to be giving you all of the information you need to find success in the format. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons, archetype overviews, combat tricks, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Starting things off with the set mechanics, they are Prototype, Power Stones, Unearth, Meld, and Retro Artifacts. Starting things off with Prototype, it is a mechanic that is essentially going to let you cast cards for cheaper if they are going to be smaller as a result. So Rust Goliath is a 10 mana 10/10 reach trample, but if you pay its prototype cost of 3 green, you can instead cast it as a 3/5. So all you'll be changing is the stat line, so it'll still have reach, it'll still have trample, it'll still be called Rust Goliath, but it's going to be a 3/5 instead of a 10/10. If it's not in play, if it's in your graveyard or something like that, it doesn't remember whether or not you cast it with Prototype. So it'll still be a 10 mana 10/10 if it's in your graveyard or something like that in terms of converted mana cost and things of that nature. Next up are Power Stones, and they are a certain token that is often generated by cards in the Brothers War. So for example, Stern Lesson is a card that will draw you 2 cards, then you discard a card and you create a tapped Power Stone token. And Power Stones have the ability tap, add 1 mana, colorless. This mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. So it's worth noting that there are a lot of big artifacts to cast in this set, but it's also very important to say that Power Stones can be used for all sorts of things that aren't casting spells. So you can use them for activated abilities and things of that nature. Next up is Unearth, a mechanic that is on creatures. And generally the way that Unearth works is you pay a cost, bring it back from the graveyard for 1 more turn, and then you exile it at the end of that turn. So Mishra's Juggernaut is a 5 mana 5/3 trampler that attacks each combat. And if it does die, you can bring it back for 1 more swing from your graveyard. It's also worth noting that Unearth is an activated ability, so you can use Power Stones to use Unearth costs. Next is Meld. Meld is only found on mythics and rares, and it only comes up if you get specific mythics and rares together on the battlefield at the same time. So it's not generally that relevant for limited, but if you do see Meld, it basically is if you get those 2 cards into play and then you do a certain thing, the cards will combine into 1 super card. So if you have Urza Lord Protector and the Might Stone and the Weak Stone, if you use the Meld ability, then they will turn into Urza Planeswalker, and then you'll just have this super empowered card. And the way it works in paper is you'll flip those 2 cards over, and on their backs, they naturally slot together to form the big card. And then finally, there is Retro Artifacts, and this isn't a mechanic per se, but there is going to be one of these old bordered artifacts from throughout Magic's history found in every booster pack of Brothers War. So you can see cards like Phyrexian Revoker, Wormcoil Engine, Howling Mine. There's a whole list of these cards, and it is worth noting that they are going to be found in every pack because it is a feature of the format, and so it's definitely something that you'll want to be aware of before diving in. Moving on to the top commons, in white at number 1 is Prison Sentence. This is just great removal in white. It even has some Scry 2 tacked on, so you'll be able to filter your draws in the late game or early game or whenever you cast your Prison Sentence. And then it's also nice against the Unearth mechanic because if the creature never enters the graveyard, they're never able to use that Unearth ability. At number 2 is Airlift Chaplain. It might seem small as a 1/1 flyer, but it does have a little bit of a card advantage ability built in, along with some selection, because it's not just drawing a card. It lets you draw a land when you want one, if you find one in your top 3, or a small creature if you find one. It does have some deck building restrictions if you want to consistently hit the card advantage ability, but even just getting a 3 mana 2/2 flyer is not that bad as a floor, so it comes in at number 2. And then at number 3 is Power Stone Engineer, a nice little 2-drop in white that gets you a little bit of value when it dies, which is pretty much all you can ask for from a 2-drop. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Weakstone's Subjugation. This is just a fantastic removal spell in blue. It can be very efficient if you're able to use it for 1 mana, but even paying 4 for this effect is not terrible. And so it's going to be solid no matter which mode you pick, and can lead to some very efficient turns. And also blue oftentimes doesn't get this sort of interaction, which is why it comes in at number 1. At number 2 is Mightstone's Animation. It is a card that needs a little bit of setup, but essentially if you are able to have a Power Stone in play, you can put Mightstone's Animation on it and essentially have a 4 mana 4/4 haste that drew you a card when it entered play, which is just absolutely fantastic and well worth the high setup cost. It also doesn't feel as bad to get blown out because if your opponent is using a removal spell on a Power Stone token that you created, you're generally not going to be that far behind. And then at number 3 is Philology Archaeologist. It's a 2-mana 0/3, but it does have the ability to get you some card advantage or come in as a 1/4, which is why it comes in at number 3, because that's a pretty good ability to have on a 2-drop. In black, at number 1 is Overwhelming Remorse. This is just a fantastic removal spell. It's oftentimes going to cost significantly less than 5 once you get to the middle stages of the game, which is often when you want to be using your premium removal spells anyway, and it is instant speed as well, so it's just a great card at number 1. At number 2 is Disfigure, great for helping you get through the early turns and just killing your opponent's small creatures. And then at number 3 is Scrapwork Rager, which is a fantastic card, not only because it's just a 3-for-1 built into a common, but also because if you do have some self-mill synergies, you can get this into your graveyard and then get an extra card out of it, even if you don't end up casting it normally. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Excavation Explosion. This card is absolutely fantastic. 3 mana to deal 3 damage to any target, so you can even hit your opponent with this card, and then you create a Power Stone token to help you with other synergies you may have. At number 2 is Unleash Shell. Normally a 5-mana red removal spell that deals 5 damage wouldn't be this highly rated, but dealing 2 damage to your opponent when you cast Unleash Shell is sneaky powerful and ends up being a very good card as a result. Instant speed is also a nice perk of the card. And then at number 3 is Tomical Scrapsmith. This card might look a little bit small as a 3-mana 2/1, but it does have the ability to get you some card advantage, or coming in as a 3/2 is not the end of the world. Though with this one, you really do hope that you'll be able to hit an artifact. So you're going to want to build your deck to have some of those artifacts in mind. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Argothian Opportunist. A 3-mana 3/2 that enters the battlefield with a Power Stone token is fantastic because there's a lot of uses for those Power Stone tokens, as we already discussed. At number 2 is Epic Confrontation, a great removal spell in green that's generally going to be able to kill what you want because green tends to have some very sizable creatures. And then at number 3 is Argothian Sprite, one of the best places to put your Power Stone token mana if you don't have a big artifact to be casting, because you can use the Argothian Sprite 7-mana activated ability and pay for it with a Power Stone token. So that may look like it costs 7, but if you have a couple Power Stones lying around, it's going to be easier to activate than it looks. And a 2-drop that scales into the late game is just fantastic. Moving on to the color rankings, it is worth noting, as always, that color rankings are generally going to be more of tiebreakers than this is the color to force, this is the color to hard avoid. But if you do have a close pick, these are the rankings. At number 1 is black. It just has fantastic removal spells and so many great commons that I couldn't even list them all in the top commons. It just has a ton of fantastic cards, and it is the number 1 color. And number 2 is green. It's a very deep color as well. It makes good use of the mana from Power Stone tokens and also just artifacts coming into play and things like that. And so it comes in at number 2. Blue is number 3. It has some decent pairings with the other colors, but it lacks a little bit of the depth of black and green. And then red and white are coming in at the tail end. They just don't have as powerful of cards of the other colors, and they don't have as good color combinations with some of the other colors. Just so they come in at the bottom of the spectrum, though by no means is any color undraftable. Moving on to the archetype overviews, it is worth noting that in the Brothers' War, some of the archetypes are less well defined than we might be used to seeing. But that's still okay. You can just put in a collection of cards of those colors and they'll often have a similar game plan. So for example, with red-white, it tends to just be an aggressive strategy. It doesn't have some overarching theme that you're trying to build towards. You just want to have a good curve, strong creatures, combat tricks, and then some removal spells to help you push through some damage. So it's got Philology Vanguard as a great way to just help buff your creatures and enable attacks. It also has first strike, so it's a good attacker itself. You've got Blitz Automaton as a nice haste threat on turn 3, or a nice finisher on turn 7 if you do get up to that much mana. And then Phalanx Vanguard as just a nice aggressive threat that can attack pretty even more effectively if you're generating some artifacts, including Power Stone tokens. Next is blue-black. This is an archetype that cares about drawing your second card in a turn, and then you get some benefit for doing that. So you get a card like Evangels of Synthesis, which is going to be able to attack as a 3/3 if you are able to draw multiple cards. You get Thopter Mechanic and Gurgling Anointer as well, which both grow when you draw your second card each turn. So you want to get these threats down early and then start reaping the reward of drawing cards. Next up is green-white. This is a deck that cares about having artifacts enter play, so importantly, that includes Power Stone tokens, but there's also some artifact creature tokens that can come into play, and then when those do come into play, you get some nice benefits. So Yoshin Dissident starts putting +1/+1 counters on your creatures. Sarenth Steelseeker gets you a little bit of card advantage or card selection by drawing you lands or filtering your draws, and then Thopter Architect can help you push through for some damage in the air if you do have some artifacts entering play. Next up is blue-red. This is a color combination that cares about casting non-creature spells. So third path Iconoclast is going to generate you some 1/1 tokens. Noteworthily, they are artifact tokens, just because those are the types of tokens you're generating a lot of the time in this set is going to be 1/1 soldier artifacts. And then you have cards like Wing Commando and Dwarven Forge Chanter at common, which also reward you for casting non-creature spells by being prowess threats. Next up is black-green. This is a graveyard-based strategy. You get Skyfisher Spider. That's a little bit of a tongue twister there at uncommon, which is a 4-mana 3/3 that is going to be able to kill a non-land permanent if you sacrifice one of your own, which is quite powerful. If you have a little disposable creature running around, you'll be able to trade that for one of your opponent's big creatures, and then you can get a little bit of life gain on the way out. Jixian Skullflayer is a great card in this sort of deck as well, because if you are able to fill your graveyard, it becomes a nice scaling threat that your opponent's eventually going to have to deal with. And then Gaia's Courser, if you are able to fill your graveyard, also is going to be able to get you some nice card advantage. And as a 4/5, it really is hard to block profitably without multi-blocking. And then moving on to white-blue, this is a soldier's strategy. So you've got Yoshin Tactician, which buffs up your other soldiers. You've got Aeronaut Cavalry, which is a flyer that also puts a counter on another soldier you control. And then you have Air Marshal, which is a great little 2-drop because not only can it get some attacks in early, but in the late game you can activate this on multiple soldiers and swing in the air and really pressure your opponent. Moving on to red-green, this is just a classic mid-range stompy, a little bit of ramp, a little bit of aggression strategy. So it really has a lot that it can do, and you'll just have to pick the most fitting path. Arbalest Engineers is a great uncommon for this deck because it can really slot into any of these different builds. If you want to be more aggressive, you can have it come into play as a 3-mana 3/3 trample haste. You can use it to generate some ramp by making a Power Stone token, or you can just finish off a creature with that extra point of damage, pick off a 1 toughness creature, or even kill your opponent if you've gotten them to 1. Alloy Animist is another cool card for this sort of deck because if you are trying to build a more aggressive variant of red-green, you can still use your Power Stone tokens as aggressive creatures because you can turn them into 4/4 artifact creatures temporarily by using that Alloy Animist. So you're able to convert some of the ramp cards into aggressive cards. And then Mishra Excavation Prodigy is also a pretty nice card for this deck because if you do have some artifacts, you can use this to ramp into your other threats, or you can use it just as a card filtering tool if you're more mid-rangey, or you can sometimes just attack them for 2 with the haste ability before using it as a little bit of a card filterer. So just another nice card for the deck. Moving on to white-black, this is a deck that cares about small creatures or creatures that cost 3 or less, and you'll just get some benefit from that. So Hero of the Dunes gives you some recursion for those small creatures and then buffs them up. Recruitment Officer lets you find them from your deck, so you really want to be able to have a lot of hits for this sort of effect so you can maximize those cards when you do draw them. And then Battlefield Butcher is just a really nice 3-mana card that can be used in this sort of strategy, something that's pretty nice to find or recur, or if you're able to fill up your graveyard so that you'll have more options for your Hero of Dunes, Battlefield Butcher gets better. So these are just the sorts of synergies. You're going to use small creatures, then use those and leverage them to get a nice advantage over the course of the game. Moving on to blue-green, this is just a classic ramp strategy. It gives you the ability to basically cast big spells or generate a lot of mana and then use that mana for different things. So Battery Bearer turns essentially all of your creatures into Power Stones if you want them, and then it'll give you some card draw if you do cast big creatures. Cradle Clear Cutter is a nice addition to this deck because not only can you cast it on turn 3 to get you a little bit of ramp, but you can also cast it on turn 6 to ramp you into even bigger cards. And then Spotter Thopter is a nice addition at the top end where it's going to be castable in the early turns, but really thrives if you can pay that 8 mana cost, get a massive flyer, and then scry you into your next couple big threats. And then finally, moving on to black-red, this is an archetype that cares about sacrificing things. So Junkyard Genius is going to come in and create a Power Stone token, and then you can sacrifice a creature or artifact to give your other creatures +1/+0 and menace and haste. So you can use that as a way to push damage with your creatures by sacrificing spare small creatures or Power Stones that you have. Jixian Infiltrator is a great card to get down early in this deck because when you sacrifice another permanent, so artifacts or creatures or any other type of permanent, you get to put a counter on the Infiltrator. So that can stack however many times you want. You can make this into a truly scary threat. And then Penregan Strongbolt is a common that gives you the ability to sacrifice artifacts. So if you don't get some of the premium sacrificers at uncommon, you can pick up a Penregan, and then you can use that to get rid of your Power Stones and grow the Pendragon temporarily while also dealing some damage to your opponent. So really able to leverage those Power Stones into damage instead of just using them for ramp. So as I was saying when I mentioned them at the beginning, they have a lot of uses. Moving on to the combat tricks in the set, there are not a ton of tricks in this set, especially compared to previous sets, especially at higher rarities. These are pretty much the only ones you're going to see. So in white, there's a couple of 1-mana tricks, Lauren's Escape and Military Discipline. So you have to be careful if your opponent does have a single white mana available. In black, there's Ashnod's Intervention and Moment of Defiance, but it is worth noting that these cards aren't going to leave your opponent's creature in play. So it can be used to win a combat, but the card is going to end up back in your opponent's hand, or it's not even going to come back in their hand in the case of Moment of Defiance. They'll just draw a card to replace that creature. And in red, there's Whirling Strike as the main combat trick, so +2/+0, First Strike, and Trample, so beware of that if your opponent is potentially going to hit you for lethal. And Mishra's Onslaught is a mass pump spell, so if your opponent does have a lot of creatures in play, that's one to be aware of. Green does have the most combat tricks in the set. It's got Giant Growth, which is just a classic trick, buffs your creature up pretty sizably for just 1 mana. Gaia's Gift, which gives a lot of different abilities for 2 mana. And then Tawnos' Tinkering, which is a card you're really going to hopefully be able to avoid. It is quite expensive to use, and so if your opponent attacks you and has 4 mana available, definitely think of this card so you don't just get clobbered, because if you play around it, it's going to be much harder for them to get a nice advantage out of that card. Moving on to some trap cards to be avoided. Calamity's Wake is not going to do enough, even if your opponent has a lot of graveyard synergies. Don't bring this card in out of your sideboard, because putting yourself down a card to get rid of some of your opponent's extra value is just not going to be worth it. So Calamity's Wake is best left avoided. Takesha's Dig Site is another one that you shouldn't be playing, even though it looks quite appealing as a way to filter through your draws once you get to the late game. The fact that it doesn't tap for a color of mana is very, very bad for this sort of card. In the early turns of the game, you can oftentimes just lose the game if you are missing a color of mana, and the fact that you're going to get a little bit of upside in the late game is not worth that cost. And then third is Splitting the Power Stone, which is a card that has a lot of text, and it's an uncommon, so it looks like it should be better than it actually is. But in reality, you're oftentimes going to be sacrificing 1 Power Stone to make 2 Power Stones, which isn't going to be worth it, because spending 3 mana just to generate a Power Stone is not a good deal. So you should be avoiding these cards. Next up are some combos that you can assemble. Starting off with the classic, you steal your opponent's creature and sacrifice it. So Sibling Rivalry is 3 in a red. You gain control of target artifact or creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste. And so just the classic steal your opponent's creature, and it even creates a Power Stone token at sorcery speed. And then you can combine that with sacrifice effects that are often found in black, though there are a couple in red as well. And then you can steal your opponent's creature and then sacrifice it. Killzone Acrobat is particularly nice because you don't have to pay mana to sacrifice the creature. So you can just play your Sibling Rivalry on turn 4 and immediately swing in with the Acrobat and sacrifice that creature to use your Rivalry as a kill spell. Next up is the combination of Phalagi Chain Dancer with pretty much any combat trick, but particularly Giant Growth is a really nice combo. So basically, because it has the ability to gain double strike, and then you also have these combat tricks that can give +3/+3 in Giant Growth, you can hit your opponent for 10 damage out of nowhere. So you have your Chain Dancer in play, you attack them for 2. If they don't block, you just give it double strike, give it +3/+3. All of a sudden, your opponent has taken half of their life in one swing, and it obviously can be combined with multiple combat tricks to do even more damage. And then the final combo I'm going to be discussing is a fun one between Urza Power Stone Prodigy, Clay Revenant, and Thrawn Vigil. So if you do have Urza Power Stone Prodigy in play, you get rewarded when you discard 1 or more artifact cards, because you're going to be able to create a Power Stone token. Clay Revenant is a card that when you discard it is actually quite nice, because you can then pay 3 mana to return it from your graveyard to your hand. And it's also worth noting that you can use Power Stones to pay that activated ability, at least the colorless part. So you use Urza Power Stone Prodigy to draw a card, discard Clay Revenant, pay 3 mana, put Clay Revenant back in your hand. Some of that 3 mana is going to come from the Power Stones that you generated from Urza Power Stone Prodigy. And then if you combine that with Thrawn Vigil, which is whenever 1 or more artifact or creatures leave your graveyard during your turn, you put a counter on target creature, you can also be growing Urza in the process, because Clay Revenant is going to be leaving your graveyard to go back to your hand. Urza is going to be generating you card advantage by just drawing you a card and then discarding the Clay Revenant, getting back the Clay Revenant. It's just a beautiful, beautiful cycle. You're also going to be growing your creatures because of Thrawn Vigil, so just an absolutely glorious combo if you are able to assemble it. It does require a couple of uncommons, but keep your eye out. Next up is mana fixing, and it is sparse in this set. In the land, you'll find Evolving Wild, so this is a common in the set, and it's pretty much the best fixing you're going to have access to. So if you are trying to splash, definitely prioritize those Evolving Wilds. There's also Energy Refractor, which is a bit costly to use as mana fixing, but it can get the job done in a pinch, and it does replace itself and has some synergies with other artifacts in the set if you do want to use it. And then in green, there's Bushwhack at uncommon, which does have the ability to search for a basic land card, though oftentimes you'd rather use it as a fight spell. And then Sentinel Stalwart is a way that you can sometimes use your Power Stones or spare creatures you have to tap the Sentinel Stalwart for some mana, but generally this card is just underpowered and not one you're going to want to include in your deck, and it's vulnerable if you are using it to splash, because if it's a creature, so your opponent can just kill it and then you lose access to your splash color. So I'd recommend against using the Stalwart in that capacity. And so generally, if you are going to be splashing, you'll want to rely on Evolving Wilds or sometimes Energy Refractor. Moving on to some final tips. The first one is that Power Stone tokens are more flexible than they look. Make sure you draft cards that can put them to good use. There are tons of ways to generate Power Stone tokens in this set, and there are also tons of ways to use them. As we've already seen through the course of just looking at some of these cards, you can use them to cast big artifacts. You can use them to pay activated abilities. You can use them just to generate artifacts for cards that care about having artifacts enter play. You can sacrifice them. There's so many different uses for Power Stone tokens, and you're going to want to make sure that your deck uses them in some capacity, even if it might not be the default conventional or plan A mode of using them to cast big artifacts. And then the other tip that I have is you can play your removal spells for artifacts and enchantments in your main deck. So a card like Disenchant actually has a lot of targets in this set. Not only are there these massive artifacts that you'll want to be able to kill, but there's also the white removal spell that is an enchantment-based removal, and there's the blue removal spell that is enchantment-based removal that we already saw earlier. And so you're going to have some nice targets for your enchantment and artifact removal in this spells that kill artifacts and enchantments in this set. It's always confusing to get the wording right on that, but those cards are definitely playable. So Disenchant is a good one at common, and then Shoot Down in green is also a good one to be aware of, and that one even can exile creatures so you can avoid graveyard shenanigans. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember that if you did enjoy it, hit that like button, subscribe for more content, and comment below if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave #BrotherBattler in the comments section down below, because now that you've watched this video, you'll be ready to battle some Brothers War draft. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.